I'm Barb Desjardins. I'm the mayor of the Township of Esquimalt and lead co-chair of the police board. I do that because we recognize that myself and Marianne Alto have two hats at this meeting, and so sometimes it's a bit of a challenge with those two hats. I would like to start with an acknowledgement that we are within the traditional territories of the Lekwungen people, Songhees and Esquimalt, and we thank them for their stewardship of the lands from time immemorial, and that we get to live, work, play, and learn within that territory, and that this is only a beginning to a long process for reconciliation and relationships. Marianne will also have some opening words, but what I'd like to do right now is quickly go around the table and introduce ourselves, and I will start with Mayor Alto.
Hi everybody, I'm Marianne Alto, and they tell me I'm the mayor of Victoria, which as a bonus makes me the co-chair and the second co-chair of the Victoria Police Board.
And hi everybody, I'm Suzanne Thompson. I'm the Deputy City Manager and CFO for Victoria.
Evening everyone, Jocelyn Jenkins, City of Victoria and City Manager.
Darlene Rochford, Councillor of Esquimalt.
I'm just going to ask you to try and use your mic. I know that you have to share somewhat, but thank you.
I'm Charlotte Huber with the Victoria Esquimalt Police Force.
Chris Coleman, City of Victoria.
Stephen Hammond, City of Victoria.
Do this separately. Andrea Boardman, Councillor for the Township of Esquimalt.
Hi everyone, I'm Matt Dell, Councillor in the City of Victoria.
Hi, I'm Duncan Cavins with the Township of Esquimalt, also Councillor.
Good evening everyone, Colin Watson, Deputy Police Chief, Victoria Police Department.
Hi everyone, Del Manning, Chief of the Victoria Police Department.
Steve Herkham, I'm the controller of the police department.
There we go. All right, Tim Morrison, Councillor, Township of Esquimalt.
Good evening, Mark Gardner, City of Victoria Councillor.
I'm Krista Loughton, City of Victoria Councillor.
I'm Michaela Hayes, Victoria Esquimalt Police Board.
Susan Kim, City of Victoria Councillor.
Hi everyone, Dave Thompson, City of Victoria Councillor.
Hello everyone, Dan Horan, Chief Administrative Officer in Esquimalt.
And Ian Irvin, Director of Finance for the Township of Esquimalt.
Thank you, and I'm just going to assume that everyone out behind are observing. We also have regrets from our board. Please introduce yourself.
Sorry, Jeremy Cardona, City of Victoria Councillor.
Thank you. And we have more? I will say while we're waiting that we do have regrets from the Victoria and Esquimalt Police Board Finance Chair Doug Crowder and Councillor Armour and Hallowell from Township of Esquimalt. Sean, would you like to introduce yourself?
Good afternoon, I'm Sean Dillon, and I police board member since 2019 and currently the chair of Drivers Committee.
Thank you. So you have an agenda in front of you, but what I thought that I would like to do is just outline that this year is a little bit different than in past years. Normally this meeting occurs in November. Without an election, it runs fairly smoothly. The board approves its agenda in October. We have the joint council meeting, board and council meeting in November, and that allows for the differences in the past of two different budget process timelines. In the past, the City of Victoria has done a lot of budget work in the fall, so November, December. Esquimalt Council, because we have a what is called payment in lieu of taxes from the federal government, we don't start our process until late February and March. So that difference in timeline adds some complexity to how we all go about our decision making. This presentation is a first blush. It's your opportunity to hear from each other, to ask questions of the board. Tonight, it will be Mr. Hercombe that will, our comptroller, who will be providing the information. Of course, we've got the chief here, and to help answer any questions, and the board are here as well. Everyone, there is no such thing as a question, a silly question. This is all about learning. After this, there will be another presentation at your council table for more in-depth information again, and that you as a Esquimalt Council or Victoria Council can really hone in on your thoughts and questions around the budget. I just have some housekeeping. The mics, please try to remember to turn it off when you're done. Apparently, if 4 or more are going, it'll the whole system, and that could be fun. We depending on the timing, we'll try and take a very quick break between the information session and the presentation. The washrooms are just across the hall, and at that time you can just stretch your legs. So depending on how long the questions from the information session go, that can be a little shorter or a little bit longer. I'm going to turn it over to Mayor Alto now for a few more words.
Thanks very much, Mayor Desjardins. And I'll be brief. This is my first session like this from this chair, although I have had the pleasure, and it has been a pleasure, to be part of these sessions for a number of years as a council member. Thank you for doing the land acknowledgement, Mayor Desjardins. I think it's always important for us to begin every gathering with those words, those very kind and thoughtful words. I think it is notable in this term to realize that because of the election and the work that our council did in a fairly intensive learning period in the fall, that our budgets are now a bit more closely aligned as we're doing budgeting just starting now. And so that may actually be an advantage for this year. We may consider whether or not that's a sufficient advantage to look ahead to keep that process in place in the future. I think for us today it's really important, as Mayor Desjardins has said, that this is an opportunity for you to ask a lot of questions. It may be that some of your questions require enough detail that you do want to hold them over to your individual council sessions, but by all means, please ask anything that you want. This is a time for us to explore and learn about just exactly what we'll be presented with during our budget sessions. And secondarily for me, I just want to comment that for me, this has been obviously a bit of a new perspective, sitting from the chair, not just as the mayor, but as a co-chair of the police board. And what I've been really struck by is that despite the fact that we do have very different communities, and these communities, I think in this particular instance, were brought together by the province for a variety of reasons that we don't really need to go into tonight. For me, what I've been really struck with is the intense amount of agreement around the need for us to be collaborative and to work together to provide the policing services that we always want to consider and deliver to the residents of both communities. And so I'm certainly approaching this work from that perspective, and I would say that certainly in my experience with the police board is that everyone is. And I think that's a great place from which to start. It's a place of agreement in what we're all here to do, and a way to ask questions and get answers and explore together to just do it better. So much appreciated for you being here tonight. Please ask anything you want, as Mayor Desjardins has said. And if there's anything that you think either can't get a sufficient answer tonight, park it, and we will have an opportunity, the Mayor says, to speak in a little bit more detail at each of our councils. Thanks very much, and have a good evening.
Thank you, and I'm going to look to Mr. Hercombe.
Thank you, Mayor, and a warm staff and councillors. The purpose of this presentation is to provide new councillors with basic information on the police board governance model and a refresher for returning councillors. I am presenting this today on behalf of Doug Crowder, who cannot be with us today. So just bear in mind that I am speaking on behalf of the police board when I give this presentation. The next few slides present a high-level overview of the Police Act and the Framework Agreement, under which we must work together to ensure both municipalities are provided adequate public safety. The responsibilities and relationships of the board, municipalities and the province are laid out in those documents, as well as in the 2002 Amalgamation Order and the board's terms of reference. We urge you to familiarize yourself with these documents. Lastly, the presentation includes some of the more recent challenges and disputes among the three parties that still must be resolved. So first, we're just going to talk about the Police Act a little bit. The Police Act outlines all the roles and responsibilities of police services in BC. For the purposes of this presentation, as it's a large and lengthy act, we're going to look at two sections in particular. Section 26, which covers the establishment of police boards and in particular sets out the board's responsibility in setting priorities, goals and objectives for the police department. In doing so, we must take into consideration the priorities, goals and objectives not only of both municipalities but also of the provincial government. Section 27 of the Police Act covers the approval and expenditure of funds. The board determines an annual provisional budget to carry out our priorities, goals and objectives, which is then subject to municipal council's approval under their budget processes. Although the boards seek the municipality's input in consultation with the Chief Constable, the board is an independent, non-political appointed body and undertakes its duties objectively and very seriously on behalf of the municipality. We are the only board in BC that represents two municipalities and therefore requires budget approval from more than one council. As you can see, this often creates significant challenges. The Framework Agreement sets out the working arrangement amongst the two municipalities and the board, the rules of engagement, so to speak. This is not a long document, and I urge all councillors to read it. There is a copy included in the agenda package for today's meeting as well. The current agreement was negotiated in 2014 and is set to expire at the end of this year, unless extended by all parties. Although there is a provision to extend the agreement, the Township of Esquimalt has served notice that it wishes to terminate that agreement and is exploring alternative service delivery models. The City of Victoria has also indicated a desire to exit the agreement. The termination of the agreement does not on its own, however, result in the termination of the provincial amalgamation. This requires the province to rescind the order in council. Failing this, a new agreement would need to be negotiated. The budget process for municipal police boards is laid out in the Police Act. The board is responsible for presenting a provisional police budget to provide adequate and effective policing for both municipalities as a whole. Councils have the authority under the Act to either accept that budget or reject items within that budget. Due to the uniqueness of our situation, rejection of an item in the budget by one council means that item cannot be included in the budget, regardless of the other council's decision. This has caused complications in past budget years where priorities for the two councils do not align. The only formal mechanism to resolve such disputes is to appeal to the province under Section 27 of the Police Act. The province has the authority to determine whether or not a disputed item should be included in the budget, but this process is lengthy and contentious. Our budget process, which is described in the next presentation, attempts to navigate these difficulties. Victoria and Esquimalt councils serve two very different communities, often resulting in different priorities when it comes to approving additional police resources. The Framework Agreement required an efficiency review, which was completed in 2017 by Myers Norris Penny. This report contained a number of recommendations, most of which were implemented. It also, however, identified the need for additional resources. Those resources were not always approved in the budget process, and as a result, appeals were made to the province 3 out of the last 5 budget years for those those resources to be included in the budget. As you can see in there, in 2 of those years, they were approved by the province, and 1 they were denied. The appeal process can be lengthy, and your police department must continue its operations without the requested resources in the meantime, which can seriously impact the ability of the police department to meet its priorities and obligations. In 2020, a further study, titled the Lepard Report, was performed under Section 42 of the Police Act, addressing issues surrounding the budget funding formula and, I quoted, rubbing points surrounding the framework agreement. So as a result, the Lepard Report recommended a new funding formula, which was accepted by both municipalities. This funding formula consisted of 2 parts. The first part, a 3-factor funding formula based on a 5-year rolling average of dispatch calls, criminal code, and population. This would on its own have resulted in a reduction of Esquimalt share from 14.7% to 11.553% of the total budget. The reduction, however, was offset by a 2.14% increase for what was termed as additional police resources allocated to the Esquimalt Dedicated Municipal Division. This can best be described as the actual number of officers for the dedicated division under Appendix A exceeding the number there would have been if we had simply allocated those resources based on the funding formula itself. It's important to note that assessing the adequacy of those resources as a whole was not within the scope of that report. The net result was an allocation of 13.67% of Esquimalt, down from 14.7%. The Lepard Report also indicated that Esquimalt might be able to reduce their share of the costs by way of a review of its dedicated officers per Section 4 of the Framework Agreement. Esquimalt subsequently requested such a review. So Esquimalt requested the review of its dedicated officers under 4.5 of the Framework Agreement as the Lepard Report had recommended. The board responded with a proposal to move 3 officers from Esquimalt to Victoria with no overall reduction in strength. This would have resulted in a shift of 1.2% of the overall budget from Esquimalt to Victoria. Esquimalt accepted that proposal. Victoria did not, leaving the deployment at status quo and no change to Appendix A in the agreement. The matter was then referred to the Administrative Committee, but the parties could not come to an agreement. The matter was then referred to arbitration. To date, that arbitration has not occurred, and with no apparent movement by either municipality, the board has taken a leadership role in asking the 2 municipalities and their new councils to work together to resolve this situation, either cooperatively or through arbitration without further delay. At this time, I would like to hand this back to Mayor Desjardins, who will open it up to questions from 2 councils.
Thanks very much, Steve. Welcome to the elephant. Are there questions? Yes, Ms. Kim.
Thank you. I'm just, why is arbitration so delayed? Who's responsible for that? And if we did want to kickstart it, what's that process?
I guess. Who's going to answer these questions, Steve?
I think I can volunteer to answer that question. So where we're sitting at right now is, I believe the police board has sent a letter to the municipalities requesting that we move ahead with this arbitration. The board has engaged a lawyer, and we have received a response from Esquimalt's lawyer at this point, indicating that no movement towards arbitration has yet occurred. I'm not certain if we've received a reply from Victoria to date.
Good evening. My name is Thomas Vorsky. I'm the city solicitor for Victoria, and just very briefly, the city has provided its position actually before the letter from the board was sent, and I've been in contact with the lawyers for Esquimalt and the board, and we're working through some of those issues in terms of the arbitration right now.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much. Councillor Kim actually took my question.
Further questions? Yes.
So is it safe to assume that arbitration is the only way forward here?
Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, so under the framework agreement, turn it off again. Under the framework agreement, it goes to the, if you can't reach an agreement, it goes to the administrative committee, and then if the administrative committee cannot come to an agreement, it must go to arbitration. So that's a term of the framework agreement. So that's basically the next step in the process that has to happen.
Thank you for the question. Are there further questions? My mic keeps going out. So. Please, Councillor Cavan.
I was just wondering if you could comment about the who made the proposal for this move of 3 officers and how did that agreement go? And I've been trying to understand why Victoria didn't accept it. So I'm just curious if someone can comment on what the point was.
Thank you for your question. Yeah, so what happened is the township had requested an alternate deployment model that adjusted Appendix A within the framework agreement. And they looked at if they could have a reduction of police officers that were dedicated to the Esquimalt division. I met with my leadership team and I made a presentation. Inspector Michael Brown was with me when we did that to the council of the day in the township. And the recommendation was that we could redeploy 2 resources to the city of Victoria. The township councillors asked if 3 was an option, and I said that certainly could be an option, but there would be a reduction in service if that happened. But it certainly, if it was the wishes of the township to do that, that could be accommodated. It was at that time that we did receive a letter from the township indicating that they would like to move those 3 resources as per the presentation that I conducted over to the city. And so that letter, there was an exchange of letters and that information went over to the city. But the way that the framework agreement is worded is essentially that, I had made that agreement to that decision pending Victoria accepting those 3 officers, because it was going to be the way that the deployment model was going to be, and I want to get into the details here, it was going to reallocate some of the supervision that we had in the township and balance some of that with the Victoria division. So it was incumbent upon the city of Victoria accepting those officers to transfer them from the Esquimalt division. And so Victoria indicated, I'm not going to speak to why Victoria indicated that they were not going to allow this or why they were going to reject it. But as Mr. Hercombe commented, the dispute resolution process is listed quite clearly under the framework agreement in section 12. And so when the parties can agree, there's a process to resolve some of those disputes, and that's the process that we're following. And I think on behalf of, if I could speak, Mayor Desjardins, on behalf of the board and certainly the police department, we're represented at the administrative committee. We all would have liked for this to have been concluded by now and for us to have a final decision on it from an arbitrator. And it's just unfortunate that we're still waiting.
And I will add, it wasn't only the chief, the board had to approve that new deployment as well. So it moved forward from the board as well. Other questions? We're not going to need that break.
Yeah, thank you. And really pushes things twice. My question is almost more of a comment, which is that I have a lack of clarity about how this yet to be resolved arbitration, presumed arbitration, will have the impact it will have on our respective budgeting processes. And if there will be any ambiguity about undertaking that process in absence of information, since we don't actually know where things will land. So I'm finding it difficult to enter into the question of the police budget when this issue has not been resolved. So that's more of a comment than a question, but maybe the board wants to take a crack at it.
I think I can just speak in terms of the board, as the board has been wanting to get this issue resolved for quite some time, so it's in the board's interest to do that. So obviously it creates just as much problems for us as it does for you in your budgeting decisions. So I think it's in all of our interest to get this resolved quickly.
Councillor Morrison.
Just on the arbitration, I wondered if there's an estimate of the cost, and then the reason I ask that, is there an ability to go back to the administrative committee if all parties agree? Or is it pretty much, as you said, has to go to arbitration?
I can comment on that, Councillor Morrison. The administrative committee has come together, and we're at an impasse. The administrative committee could not resolve what the issues were, and again, there's a proper dispute resolution process highlighted in the framework agreement, and we're following that process. It's unfortunate that it's come to this, but that's what all parties agreed to when we originally signed off on the framework agreement.
Okay, sorry, just for the chair again. The only reason why I ask is that obviously the individuals involved at the political level has changed. There's a new council for both Esquimalt and much more for Victoria, and I wonder if there was direction given from those councils to say try and get back to avoid arbitration and go back to the administrative committee with the purpose of actually getting to an agreement. Essentially a change in position of whatever the opposition was that is causing this arbitration to be kicked in. I know that's more of a political question, but I guess what I'm asking is there any way that we can go back to the administrative committee where it must go to dispute resolution arbitration? And I think you said that, if I understood your answer, is that it has to go to arbitration, but there's no way for the political individuals to pull it backwards.
I'm going to answer, and the chief can correct me if I'm wrong, but where there's a will to make change and avoid a lengthy process and a costly process, I think it would be welcome. But all parties would have to come together to retry. This arbitration is it's already a year old. It's not going to happen quickly, and here we come to the end of a framework agreement. So if there is a willingness to take it back to your tables, then I would suggest that occur back at the tables and let's see what comes out of it. None of us really want to keep going through this process. Chief?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that sentiment is shared by all parties of the framework agreement. And we're truly at an impasse that the administrative committee felt could only be addressed. And Councillor Morrison, to your question about since October 15th, there's new people sitting at the table and there's some new faces, could there be an appetite? I can't answer to whether Esquimalt and Victoria Council have had these in-camera discussions with their council, and as far as I know, there's been no changes, and the only path forward is really go through an arbitrated process.
Councillor Rochford.
Thanks. So, Mayor Dejean mentioned that the framework agreement is coming up, which we all know. And if this continues and our framework agreement comes up and we're without one, what does that actually mean for our councils?
This is where it gets a little tricky. Just the way the framework agreement works is that yes, you have the ability to terminate that framework agreement. However, it doesn't terminate the amalgamated police department. So failing, so basically the process right now where the Esquimalt is going through is they're coming up with a proposal for a service delivery model of their own. The province will make a decision on whether they want to do that or not, or whether they want to continue with an amalgamated police department. If the province decided to continue with an amalgamated police department, the amalgamated police department carries on. However, we will have to renegotiate a framework agreement moving forward in order to operate that.
And it's my understanding that the OIC, the Order in Council, stays in place until some full change has occurred. And that is to avoid what is happening in Surrey. I have Councillor Boardman and then Dale.
Hi, this is more of a comment and probably could be very simplistic, but it seems to me that Esquimalt is looking for 3 less officers, and in the budget we're going to look at in a few minutes, VicPD is asking for 3 additional officers. So I don't actually know the question to frame with that, but it seems like kind of an obvious thing. So what am I missing? Thank you.
Yeah, unfortunately, the way that the PARD formula works out is the calculation to adjust for the police officers, the extra police officers in Esquimalt, doesn't just allocate the cost of those police officers, it allocates the cost of policing per officer. So it essentially increases that cost to about $250,000 per officer that gets moved from one dedicated division to another. And also in the Appendix A, the dedicated municipal division is a very defined resource. So depending on what those additional police officers are, they may or may not be part of a dedicated municipal division. So it's always a complicated answer. I'm sorry, but
Yeah, but I would think that those incremental costs are still less than 3 net new police officers. I understand that we have to add all the other services on, right?
yeah, I mean the shift in the funding formula. Sorry, I'm playing a game with the mic. The shift in the funding formula is more than the cost of an additional police officer, and that's the issue with that one.
I'm just looking for a little background on where this issue came from with the moving the 3 officers. I imagine Esquimalt appeared to be over-resourced and Victoria under-resourced. Is your take on it that these guys were just not doing enough work in Esquimalt essentially and needed to be shifted over? And if that is the case, that was 2021, a couple of years ago now. Is that still the case where there's just not enough happening in Esquimalt, so to speak?
Yeah, no, that certainly wasn't the case. So this all stemmed from phase 1 and phase 2 of Mr. Doug Lepard's report. The first one really looked at the budget allocation formula and looked at what metrics were modernized metrics that could be used to determine what the funding formula was. And you heard Mr. Hercombe kind of walk you through that process. What's unfortunate is in his phase 1 report, Mr. Lepard mentioned the 5 additional officers. And I wish you used other terminology, but what that meant to the township was, well, we have 5 extra police officers. And if we are paying more, I think it was 2.14%, for those 5 extra resources, and it's determined that they're not required, then perhaps we don't need them and our costs would go down. What's unfortunate is you have to read the report in the proper context. And so what Mr. Lepard meant was, here's the total number of police officers that are working in the patrol division at VicPD. If I go solely based on the budget allocation formula that he determined, it turned out that the township had 5 more. So he had to account for those 5. They weren't necessarily extra officers. I would tell you that the Victoria division is understaffed and we need more officers. So he just took the total amount, did a simple kind of calculation, and the way that he wrote it up caused a bit of confusion and a number of meetings. In fact, Mr. Lepard came to the township and provided a kind of an explanation as to what he meant when he said the 5 additional officers, and those discussions kind of took place. So it's now, in the end, when the township asked me, because the township has every right under the framework agreement to say, we want to look at our resource strength. Could we reduce our resources? And they asked me to critically look at the resources. As I said, through the police board, and Mayor, thank you for clarifying that, the board did support it. My recommendation was that we could go down by 2 resources, share the supervision between the township division and the Victoria division, and that would be a real good way to kind of move forward and also actually provide shared supervision between a smaller Esquimalt division versus a larger Victoria division. And as I said, the township did ask me for a third officer, which I said could happen. And that's where it started from, and unfortunately, we find ourselves at an impasse.
Councillor Thompson. It's only one mic at a time, I found out.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to go back to the previous line of questions and discussion. And if the, that line was, 3 officers versus the sort of agreed cost of what 3 officers is, even though it's not the same thing. I'm just wondering if there's an opportunity to just strike a separate deal to change the costing for those 3 officers to address that sticking point.
They're conferring.
Well, yeah, I'm gonna let Mr. Hercombe talk about this, but it's complicated. It honestly really is. And Mayor Desjardins will confer on this one, but the framework agreement is less than ideal. It worked at the time to set dedicated resources in Appendix A and talk about what resources were there and what the cost allocation was going to be between the township and the city. But there is an opt-in clause, but that has to be initiated by the City of Victoria. So if the City of Victoria felt that they needed and wanted to have extra VicPD officers, then they can make that request. It's not really for the board or the department to go to the city to say that this is what you need. In fact, that's kind of the step we're at through the arbitrated process. So I just want to turn it to Mr. Hercombe to kind of clarify what I've said or maybe add to it to provide a bit more clarity.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is that in the LePard report, it recommended a way to allocate those resources out. By following that formula, the costs of policing would move with each officer. That doesn't mean to say that you can't agree on something else. That doesn't mean to say you can't sit down and agree on how those resources would get moved. All it meant is that all parties agreed to that funding formula. So I think if there's a will, there's a way. There's a way that everything is up for negotiation, and I think that's what the mayor is alluding to.
Thanks for that. I'm sure that I still don't understand the complexity and won't by the end of this meeting. But yeah, I was just wondering if maybe the co-chairs could also speak to whether it's possible in the context of further work by the administrative committee or an arbitration process to strike a separate agreement acknowledging the limitations of the existing agreement.
I think your question is whether there's interest to review and make changes to the framework agreement? No. A separate agreement. I think what you're hearing around the table is we're in a logjam and ideas are important to see if we can change this logjam. And there are 3 parties that are all wanting to change. I would say in the most simplistic way that Esquimalt, through the framework agreement, has learned a considerable amount around what policing requirements we have and we need. And that's because prior to the framework agreement, there was no real data collected and provided. Since the framework agreement, we get quarterly reports on the statistics. We are also now getting separate crime severity indexes and all of those things that tell us what those needs of Esquimalt are, and Victoria for that matter. And the LePard report was initially to help review review the cost allocation formula, but did come up with this difference in number of police officers, which he referred to as extra in Esquimalt, and the chief has referred to tonight as Victoria being underserved. And so there is a cost allocation that goes with those officers. And so if there's a way that we can meet the needs of the communities, the board is certainly willing to open and have those discussions. I can say that.
Thanks very much. And harkening back to Mayor Desjardins' first comment, I'm going to speak two different ways with my hat on as the co-chair of the police board. I think that it would be fair to say, and anyone in the police board can please correct me, that there is an absolute appetite by the board to resolve this issue, whatever manner it takes. We've gone down a road so far, and there are still avenues on that road that we can pursue, and that's certainly an ongoing conversation at the board level. And I think that there's a very consistent hope that there are ways which won't take too much longer, and which may or may not necessarily end up in an arbitrated process. That being said, I think it's also fair to say, and my interpretation from the time I've spent with the board, is that if that's what's required, that's what the board is willing to pursue. Because the board's agenda, from my perspective, is to resolve this, and whatever it takes is what we'll do. Shifting hats, putting that on my hat from the city of Victoria, I think that there's been some frustration, frankly, with the inability of the administrative committee to resolve it, but I think that that's a recognition that the matters before the administrative committee are really complicated, and that the folks who are at that table are trying to accommodate the interests of all three parties. And having a three-party arbitration is tough, right? And I think that there's also a discussion that the city perhaps would benefit from with a bit of a conceptual dialogue with the board itself. And I can't speak for Esquimalt whether that would be of interest, but at this point, my understanding is that the likelihood of the administrative committee without external help trying to find a resolution to this is unlikely. And that committee has done yeoman's work over a long period of time to try and come to some acceptable compromise. In that matter, then, I think it's likely that if the administrative committee is the body that we're expecting to resolve this, they're going to need help, whether it's arbitration or mediation, one or the other. If there's a way to do it differently, and whether the board has a different idea about a way forward, that could also be an option. But for me, the bottom line here is that we have a deadline. The deadline is the end of this year, and at the end of this year, we have to come up with a plan. Whatever we can do in the short term to try and at least identify the path forward for that plan, I think we need to pursue, whether we're speaking on behalf of the board or each of the municipalities. And I think just based on what I've heard so far is that there appears to be an appetite for all three parties to explore whatever ways forward that might be. So I think for me, I'll take away from this that each of us, you and I awkwardly with two hats, we'll go back to our respective teams and explore whether or not there's any way forward that's different than what we've already pursued. In the absence of coming up with that, I think that we do have paths that are identified in the framework agreement, and then that's what we'll end up doing.
Thank you, Mayor Alto. This budget is this year coming up, and it's separate of all of that. So we can continue to answer questions around this, but we need to turn our minds to what is before us for the following year. And that is within the agreement that is there in front of us and the presentation and how that's laid out.
Yeah. Just on that, sorry, I forgot to mention it. It's actually in response to Councillor Caradona's question earlier, or maybe comment. And that is, I really agree with Mayor Desjardins in this. What we're looking at this evening is sort of two parallel processes. There's issues around governance and management over here, and that's what we've been discussing. There's also issues around how to simply fund and operate a police department, and that's why we're here. And so in my head, we've kind of had a reasonable discussion on that first part over here, that governance piece, and there's ways forward. It's complicated. Now I think it would be appropriate to turn our attention to the numbers and services and go, given all of that, and if that'll be resolved in some way, it has to be. But still, we need to figure out how to provide police services this year, at least. So I don't think they're not relevant to one another. Obviously, they're a bit interdependent, but they can be, and going back to your question, Councillor, I think it's incumbent on us to take on the responsibility of determining what the 2023 budget looks like, regardless of how the governance issue unfolds, because we have to.
Thank you. Councillor Commons.
I feel bad going back to this a little bit here, but I just wanted, something's been mentioned a couple times that's contrary to what I had understood, and so I just want to get clarification on that. It was my understanding was this reallocation of the 3 officers was agreed to by the administrative committee, and then was not rejected by, was then rejected by council. I'm not sure, that was what I understood, so I just want to make sure that's not misunderstanding at some point.
I'll try this. Yeah, that is incorrect. It was not agreed by Victoria through the administrative committee, and certainly the chief and I have had lots of comparing notes and conversations about that. But no, Victoria did not agree.
Councillor Gould.
Thank you. Thank you for reminding us that tripartite arbitrations are always difficult, and it's been described as a contract between 3 partners. If we don't come to an agreement, we are still overseen by the ordering council, which makes me have to wonder about the role of the province in this, because the flow of power actually has an invisible partner at the table. And so the first question that falls from that is, where is the province on this? And as I look around the table, I may be the only person who was here when the 2 forces were blended. And we don't need to get into that narrative. But there was clearly a belief, I think at both tables, that this would lead to regional policing. And if what we see going on around the 3 partners with an invisible 4th hand is watched by other police forces or detachments in the region, regional policing doesn't look like very much fun. So at some point, as we get into the discussion about arbitration, where's the province?
I'll just answer that within the admin committee there are certain roles for police services, and there are certain areas where police services must step aside. And I think the chief can better explain that, but we get to that step every time, and police services steps aside and leaves us holding the bag.
Yeah, Mayor Desjardins is absolutely correct. There's roles that are played, police services will chair the meetings for the administrative committee, but once it's gone down the road where there has to be an arbitrated decision made, then the province, recuses itself from that role. One thing, Councillor Coleman, I wanted to just highlight for you is you commented on if an agreement isn't reached. Even if an agreement is reached, the fact of the matter is the ordering council stands no matter what happens up until the province decides what the next steps are for policing within VicPD and for the township.
We have 10 minutes left. You have the choice of more questions, which I think would be good, or we can move into the budget presentation right away and maybe see if we actually need that little break. So I'll just look for your thoughts. Okay to move forward? All right. Grab some food or coffee or whatever, and we'll let Steve get his presentation set up. Thanks, everybody. That was good discussion.
And I will be standing in for Doug Crowder for this first part of this presentation, and then I'll be handing off to the chief, and then he'll be coming back to me again. So on behalf of the Victoria and Esquimalt Police Board, I am pleased to present the board's 2023 Police Department provisional budget. We look forward to receiving and answering questions from both councils at the end of our presentation. In the past, the board has strived to cap its budget to meet the financial targets of the municipalities. In the last few years, this was largely achieved by diverting proactive...
Steve, can you turn on your mic?
Oh, is it not on? Oh, am I on now? Yep. Oh, I just need to get closer. Okay, I'll start again. So in the past, the board has strived to cap its budget to meet the financial targets of the municipalities. In the last few years, this was largely achieved by diverting proactive community engagement resources to an increasingly short-staffed front line, which clearly resulted in a no-win cycle. I believe that we have begun to reverse this cycle to create a long-term sustainable police force. The board recommends that both councils approve the 2023 provisional budget to provide necessary resources and that we can collectively take the following actions. Support the board to continue its initiatives to address call load and lack of resources. Continue to strongly advocate for a regional police department for the South Island. Create and support a sustainable long-term staffing and financial plan to adequately resource the police department. This will require the support of the board and both municipalities. We started to undertake this project last year, but with the uncertainties associated with the much delayed arbitration process and funding delays associated with the Section 27 budget appeals to the province, we had to hold off on this until we had better insight as to the near-term budget. My last request to you is that municipalities and councils find a way to work collaboratively on ensuring that our police provide the best service possible to both communities. We recognize that our two municipalities have different needs. However, your police board is obligated to act in the best interest of both municipalities as a combined board and police department. The budget cycle starts in April, when the board directs police management to commence next year's budget process. This process may seem complex and lengthy, but given our many stakeholders and reporting relationships, the board believes that this is a necessary and worthwhile process. I would like to add that this process is more than just going through the motions. This board, in our oversight role, challenges and questions the police department budget requests. This is one time where we, the board, get to get into the weeds. Furthermore, and hopefully, the councils will agree, our budget oversight is not just looking at cost and cost cutting, which of course are important. Our primary role is to ensure that adequate and effective police services are provided to our municipalities. Sometimes this also means investing in additional resources. The board encourages both municipalities to pass the budget to ensure safe and effective policing for the community as a whole. We recognize that this is a very difficult challenge, but we encourage you to work together and to pass the very best budget possible for both communities. The board continually strives to align the budget process with both the board's strategic plan and management's divisional action plans. The chief and deputies work with senior leadership to determine deployment of police resources based on risk, available resources, and operational priorities to form the basis of the budget. Information packages go out to senior managers in the spring, who then work with their staff, assess risks, priorities, resources, and external pressures to determine the appropriate resources required to support their divisions. Previous budget line items are not considered. Each division must develop their budgets from the ground up and align with their divisional action plans. Just pause for a second just so you can see what's up on the screen there. Our continued efforts to improve transparency in the police operations include our annual budget process. And in being fully transparent, we must work collectively and collaboratively to create a proactive police force. So in the next few slides, I'm just going to go through some of the feedback we have with councils. We engaged with both councils, albeit the previous councils, in July of 2022, and this helped us form the basis of the budget. We heard valuable feedback which was shared with the board prior to further budget discussions and consideration. This list highlights the main areas that council supported. Plus, the concerns expressed by councils are also highlighted here, all of which the board agrees with. And we asked for and received suggestions for potential improvements, all of which we share and are working on. In addition to being accountable to the Victoria and Esquimalt communities, the Police Board is accountable to the Provincial Ministry of Public Safety, and we must comply with the Ministry's priorities. These are the highlights of Premier Eby's recent announcements on public safety. We look forward to provincial leadership on these matters, seeing that these priorities are to a large extent outside of the police and indeed municipalities' control, but significantly impact our operations and ability to provide public safety. After extensive consultation with the communities and councils in 2019, we arrived at the 3 strategic goals, which in turn are driven down through the divisional action plans. The document is a living, working action plan against which progress is reported each quarter to the board and subsequently to the public. The annual budget process is aligned with the strategic plan to breathe life into it and hopefully ensure that we stay on track. The current strategic plan is a 5-year plan from 2020 through to 2024. And just to recap, our mission is to deliver excellence in public safety for 2 diverse communities through engagement, prevention, innovative policing, and the framework agreement. And as you can see up on the screen there, the goals are to support community safety, enhance public trust, and achieve organizational excellence. With that, I would like to turn the presentation over now to Chief Manick.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Mr. Hercombe, for the presentation. I've got the next 4 or 5 slides, and I'll be turning it back over to our controller to finish off. This is a really good slide to start on. It talks really about crime and data that we share. We pride ourselves at the Victoria Police Department on being open and transparent with all our communities and having that information 1 click away on our website. So what you're seeing right here is Open VicPD, and you can see there's a suite of information and dashboards that we have and quarterly reports that we share regularly with both councils. And it includes information, crime statistics, and public safety data. And today I wanted to highlight 2 key metrics, which I believe are important to highlight the daily operations of the Victoria Police Department and our resource requirements. So the first one of these metrics, which is probably not unfamiliar to most of you in the room here, is the Crime Severity Index. We look at this quite regularly and really compare ourselves to other municipalities across the province about where VicPD sits. And as you can see, we have one of the highest crime severity indexes in the province of BC. These are 2021 numbers. We don't have the 2022 numbers. And what the Crime Severity Index does, it measures the volume and the severity of crime. But it really is a good measure to look at not just the number of crimes that are happening in your community, but the complexity that is attached to them, which require more resources. The other thing that this highlights for me is the costs are not shared by the region. Mr. Hercombe touched on that a little bit about why there's significant advantages having a regional approach to policing. We have a downtown core and you have the suburbs that offset the resources are able to be redeployed and you can scale up and scale down. And certainly we unfortunately don't have the advantage of doing that here in Victoria. A regional approach to shared policing services really is what is needed, and I believe that everyone benefits from a healthy and safe downtown core. How could you not? And the second metric I wanted to talk about is caseload per officer. And this is really important because we talk about the mental health and wellness of our people that are doing the work on the front lines, a challenging and demanding job that doesn't seem to get easier. The average caseload for municipal police departments in BC is 36. And as you can see, the blue bar on the right-hand side there, VicPD is at 52, factor time with the Nelson Police Department. That's the highest caseload per officer in British Columbia for municipal police departments. I think it's important to highlight the organizational pressures. Many of you will have heard what some of these pressures are, but it really is amazing to see and very, very challenging for the officers who work in the front lines to see what demands are placed on them. I can tell you that there's been increased workload with the downloading from the province. The Victoria Police Department is actively engaged in supporting people that are experiencing homelessness, mental health, addictions, right on our streets. And I know that a number of the councillors have come out with VicPD to witness that, if you already aren't aware of some of the challenges we see. On top of that, we have physical and occupational stress injuries that our officers are experiencing. We want our officers to step forward when they're feeling burnout, PTSD, or they witnessed a particular traumatic incident, or it could be a series of incidents that's accumulated by one incident at the very end that brings back flashbacks. But these are really real concerns for police officers that are working on the front lines at the Victoria Police Department. And I can tell you that in some cases, it's difficult to keep our head above water day to day. But we do an amazing job. The officers are extremely professional, and they step up when asked to do a very difficult job. The last thing I'll just comment on is the third bullet there, investigative complexity. What the courts are demanding. There's so many more provincial policing standards that are in place now that weren't a number of years ago. You look around the intimate partner violence. You look at missing person investigations and how they're conducted and all the media releases that we do to try to track down people that are missing to make sure that we're moving forward on those that are considered high risk. And the latest one is serious crime investigations. There's new standards around what is expected from the police and working with crime counsel. Some of the initiatives that we have, it's encouraging. We have a roadmap for a healthy and inclusive workplace. So that really talks about how we're working with our police board and with our union on moving forward on mental health and wellness initiatives. What are some of the things that we can do? It also looks at equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives. How we can have a respectful workplace and how we value the diversity within our organization and how we can empower all of our staff. Partnerships are critical. Partnerships have always been critical to the Victoria Police Department, but the latest new partnerships that we're going to be initiating are going to be with this new cultural liaison position, which we look to fill later on this year. Connecting with our Indigenous and our racialized communities at a level where we haven't been able to do before. The expansion of the assertive community treatment teams, where we are part of a multidisciplinary team working with mental health clinicians. And the crisis response team, or the co-response team as it's called, commonly referred to as CAR 87, where we have a plainclothes police officer working with a registered psychiatric nurse, soon to be launched in the coming weeks. When it comes to our fleet, we're looking at a green fleet. We're going to be implementing a small number of electric vehicles into our fleet and really coming up with a long-term plan, a 12 to 18-month plan of how we're going to transition our fleet to be green. And supplying, outfitting, and the infrastructure and the operational requirements are all critical as we move forward in this phase. Body-worn cameras, we want to initiate body-worn cameras as a pilot project within the Victoria Police Department. This has been a topic of discussion across North America. We feel that there's value in looking at the transparency and accountability that body-worn cameras can offer. There are a tremendous amount of logistics involved and cost and transcribing and working with Crown Counsel, especially if you have evidence that now needs to be transcribed in a digital format to go to our Crown Counsel to swear charges. But we feel that it potentially could lead to fewer complaints against officers and the reduced need for force, the fact that people are being taped. And now I'd like to turn it back over to Mr. Hercombe, who's going to walk you through the actual numbers for our 2023 budget and provide some concluding remarks to our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. So as you'll see on the board, and there is a full budget package in the agenda package for you. The budget represents an overall increase of 9.55%. I realize that is a significant number. The majority of this is required to address inflationary pressures on wages and benefits, as well as to address significant cost increases from external agencies such as recruit training and delivery of 911 and dispatch services. Also included in the budget are some additional civilian and police staffing resources. Further information is provided in the next two slides on these cost drivers, as well as the additional staffing resources, and there is further information in your packages as well. Of note, the 2022 comparative budget numbers that you see up here does include items that were approved by Victoria Council, were not approved by Esquimalt Council, but were subsequently determined by the province to be included in the budget under a provincial review. So that included overtime and 4 civilian and 6 police officer positions. So on this slide, you see some of the significant cost drivers. There is a more detailed breakdown on page 8 in the budget. The single largest cost element, unsurprisingly, is for wages and benefits. Payroll makes up more than 80% of our budget, and in the current inflationary cost of living increases are in current inflationary climate, cost of living increases are unavoidable. This increase includes funds for both wage inflation and increases that we are expecting to the cost of providing benefits to our employees. We expect to see a significant increase again in our WorkSafe premiums through our experience rating. We are, as the Chief alluded to, WorkSafe injuries. We have recently experienced another increase in those levels. Also, as we return to normal, general inflation and increased usage of our benefits will likely result in higher premiums for those services as well. The budget also includes the cost for an additional 4 civilian and 3 police officer positions. Business cases have been included for the civilian positions in your budget packages. The board also approved 3 additional police positions conditional to receiving and approving a full 5-year staffing plan in 2023. The budget also includes a $560,000 increase for the ECOM for wages and staffing increases. This does not include the future costs of Next Generation 911, which will commence in 2024. And are estimated to be a further $690,000 a year at that time. Lastly, we are requesting an increase of $500,000 to cover training fees at the Police Academy. Previously, the province provided funding to the Justice Institute of BC to cover budget shortfalls. Originally, this funding was to end in 2024, but this has subsequently been moved forward to 2022. This represents an additional cost per recruit of approximately $23,000. Other cost drivers that we are also currently contending with include inflation on software maintenance, which is very significant. Insurance premiums continue to increase at an alarming rate. Fuel costs, although they have declined slightly recently, remain at a stubbornly high value. And vehicle replacement costs are likely to stay high as well. And as the Chief noted, the 2023 budget also includes costs for a body-worn camera pilot project. There are 7 additional staffing resources included in the provisional budget, representing 4 civilian and 3 police officers. Business cases, as I mentioned, have been provided for the civilian requests. And also I mentioned the board did put a condition on the approval of the 3 police officer positions, requesting a multi-year staffing plan for discussion and approval prior to consideration of the 2024 budget. Recently, an employee-driven restructuring has taken place on the operations side of our organization. In this plan, there are a number of positions identified as future needs that will form the foundations for this report. Rather than go through each one, I'll pause for a few seconds just so you can read through the list. There is no doubt we continue to face significant cost pressures. The high pace of inflation continues to place tremendous pressure on the cost of doing business, impacting everything from fuel to supplies and wages. This budget reflects the reality that all organizations are facing in the current inflationary environment. It also includes resources required by ECOM to address service level issues, requiring a significant increase to the overall service contract. The increase covers both wage inflation and additional staffing, but as I mentioned, does not yet include Next Generation 911. We will likely see a further lift in 2024 for the implementation of that initiative. For a number of years, the province had been funding shortfalls at the Police Academy through the Justice Institute, with the plan to shift those costs to municipalities starting in 2024. They subsequently moved this forward to mid-2022. We have had to incur some expenses in 2022, and we've had to adjust our 2023 budget to account for this. Our civilian management has traditionally been quite stable. We are, however, at the beginning of a period of turnover due to retirements. This budget also includes resources to manage those transitions by addressing staffing gaps in our finance and records section of the organization. At this point, I would normally hand you back to Doug Crowder, our finance chair, but due to his absence, I shall present the remainder of his slides. It is difficult for us to achieve approval of the annual budgets by both municipalities, largely due to significant different demographics and policing priorities in the two communities. The framework agreement was revised in 2021 through adoption of the Lepard report. Esquimalt is, however, still unhappy with the budget allocation formula due to the additional costs associated with the number of offices in the dedicated municipal division. An attempted change to the allocated offices was not accepted by both parties and remains to be arbitrated per the framework agreement. Meanwhile, the long time of that process creates more uncertainty and discord amongst the parties. Esquimalt has elected to terminate the framework agreement on expiry at the end of 2023 and are currently undertaking a study to determine the future of policing in Esquimalt, subject to provisional approval. It is unclear what input Victoria and the police board will have on this process and what our future service delivery model will be as a result. As a result, it is difficult to determine our future resource needs, from staffing all the way down to fleet and information technology. We hope that 2023 brings more clarity in this regard. In closing, the board has worked hard to meet the Victoria and Esquimalt Police immediate needs, as well as the expectations of both councils, including restraining cost increases wherever possible. Realistically, as high as this budget request for 2023 is, it is still barely enough. We continue to be challenged to provide adequate police resources in areas such as police response times, capacity to address crime trends, to provide proactive policing, to offer crime prevention services, or deal with the impact of limited resources on our capacity for innovation. However, I do consider this budget request to be a critical start and an investment in our future. We can and have begun to reverse the downward cycle and create a sustainable and proactive police force that meets the needs of the entire Victoria and Esquimalt communities. This year, the board's finance committee will lead an initiative on behalf of the board to create a long-term staffing plan along with a financial forecast that projects the needs for adequate resources and builds strong support with both councils and communities. We now welcome questions or comments from both councils. And back to you, Mayor.
Thanks very much, Steve. Councillor Morrison.
Thank you. I'll apologize in advance because I have to leave for another meeting, so thank you for letting me go first, Madam Chair. Just because we have so many new faces around the table, I wonder if it might be helpful to have context around these 3 additional officers that you're requesting this year, but also in comparison or in totality of all the other requests that we've had over the last 5 years. You referenced there were the disputed officers from last year's request that now will be included and funded. Could you briefly go over last 5 years, how many FTE police officers have you been requesting each year until now?
So just going through the last reviews, the police services reviews, there was 6 police officers that were granted to us They were 2020, no, there was already one. The one from last year, sorry, I'm talking about the ones before. Yeah, so there were 6 police officers granted before, and then in the 2022 budget, there were 6 police officers, 4 civilians. Those positions for the 2022 budget that were added are 2 police officers for the co-responder team. Oh, sorry, yeah, 2 police officers for the co-responder team, a cultural liaison officer, which is a community resource officer position, 2 assertive community treatment officers, and a cybercrimes investigator. And I believe that the previous 6 were patrol positions.
Sorry, so I asked what, over the last 5 years, what's the total number of additional police officers that have been requested and granted either through dispute resolution or otherwise?
So I believe that's 12.
Sorry, I had one other question, sorry, just really quickly. You talk about the psychological and occupational health, $260,000, which is admirable as an employer. I think that's important. But also, as a good employer, you also have a pretty generous extended health plan, which you mentioned that you expect the premiums to increase this year. And that's, as I said, that's good as a responsible employer that you provide that. But does not the extended health benefits and those increased premiums, do they not cover mental health, well-being? Like, why are we spending another $260,000 in-house when we're already providing those benefits? And all the professionals that can help that they have access to through those benefit plans.
Chief, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, so currently our extended health benefits only on the psychological services only cover about $5,000 per officer, which, considering the issues that our members are dealing with, doesn't really go that far. In terms of the psychological supports and the occupational health nurse, those are specific. Those are specific resources that were recommended to be added, and Chief can talk a little bit about those discussions and what led to those positions.
Yeah, so clearly both of the councils, prior to the selection on October 15th, indicated the need to make sure that our officers have the right supports in place. I talked a little bit about that in the presentation. So one of the things where we're investing in is having an in-house psychologist, having a mental health professional working with the officers. If there's one thing that we've kind of learned through our mental health professionals is that if you're experiencing trauma, if you deal with it early and often, and if you're able to have early intervention, it actually stops a staff member from going off long term. So what we're trying to do is invest upstream with having an in-house psychologist, somebody who is familiar with the officers, the job that they do, and is able to touch base with them, and also reduce stigma at the same time. That position is in the process of being hired. We feel that it's already been funded, and we feel that it should be in place probably within maybe 6 months from now, by the time we get that position filled. Second to that is the police board has approved us hiring an occupational health nurse. So that is different. It's somebody that is embedded in the Human Resources Division, somebody who speaks the same language as WorkSafe BC. So when it comes time to helping officers that are already off, so now this is after the fact where the officers have booked off, the occupational health nurse can advocate for our officers and to talk about graduated return to work programs, what options are available, and to make sure that the officers' needs are met and the employer's needs are met to try to return people at the earliest opportunity back into the workplace.
Anything further, Councillor Morrison?
Yeah, just again, apologies I have to leave, but thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor Thompson.
Thank you, and thanks for the presentation. Chief, tonight, and when you presented to Victoria City Council on November 24th, you mentioned that downloading, which I agree is the source of a lot of, 3 decades of downloading, I agree, is the source of a lot of the problems that we're having now. And there was an earlier slide that laid out the new direction that the province is taking in a number of places. And just to pick one example, 100 complex care beds expected imminently, but there's a whole bunch of initiatives there. I'm wondering if that amounts to a kind of an uploading, a re-uploading, and what you anticipate. I'm not sure if you've done budget projections on how that might affect future budgets.
Yeah, we haven't done projections yet because there's so many variables at play as to, even Premier Eby announcing his Safer Communities Action Plan and announcing, a number of RCMP resources to be added throughout the province of BC. I think we have to just kind of be cautiously optimistic as to see what impact that will have. But I can assure you that right now, we are providing very little proactive policing. And if you want to be a healthy, progressive police department that is engaged in community, you have to have a component where your officers are out and they have a time to take a breath, be out in community, and to engage in communities instead of just responding to crimes that have occurred. And currently, we're in more of a response reactive model. So I would say that there is a significant amount of our time that is spent at supportive housing locations, which, by the way, have not worked from a public safety and policing perspective. The amount of people that are experiencing homelessness, the fact that the Victoria Police Department have to support bylaw officers so they can do their job because there's safety risks when they're out in our parks and on our streets, that is just absolutely unacceptable. But the point is, we're drawn into so many areas, and again, we're looking at the latest approval for the CAR 87 model, which is the co-response team. Partnering with a mental health professional and trying to mitigate some of those calls so that we can drive them to the healthcare system rather than into criminal justice system, I think are all bold steps. But it would be hard right now to quantify what sort of impact that is going to have on giving police back some time and availability to be able to focus on our core duties.
Thanks. Not at all. My second question is not at all a follow-up to that one, but some of your comments may be applicable. With a 9.6% budget increase, which I think is going to be probably reflected elsewhere in the City of Victoria's budget in terms of wage settlements, supply chain problems, costs, we're probably looking at a tax increase of maybe more than 9%. I'm just wondering, as somebody with a lot more political experience than I have, I'm wondering, Chief, if you might say what your top 3 selling points would be for the increase in the police budget.
Well, number one, I would say that policing is an investment. And I think that gets forgotten. Without public safety and without residents feeling safe in their communities, your work is extremely difficult. And so I think that there's no doubt about it. Policing is not cheap. This is discussions that my colleagues are having with their councils across this country. So I think that there just has to be an understanding, and this is something that I talk to regularly to our police board about, that are we transitioning to looking at efficiencies? Well, I can tell you that we just led a new restructure for the Victoria Police Department that was implemented just 2 weeks ago on the 1st of January. We've added special municipal constables, basically two tier of what the police do and what duties and functions can happen by other individuals that don't require the skill and expertise of a police officer. We use our reserve constable program and our volunteer programs to the full extent. And now really putting a lot of pressure on our health authority I think it's critical in reducing some of that downloading that's occurring. So the first one would be policing is an investment. It's certainly not cheap, but it pays in dividends. The second thing I would say is mental health and wellness of our people. We keep talking about our people, and we keep talking about how we support them. Councillor Morrison asked the question, why are we supplementing this if they have extended health plans and whatnot? It is a very, very difficult job, and the exposure to the frequency and the severity of trauma that our frontline people are exposed to is second to none. And I think that we just need to always be mindful that having more staff, I showed you the slide of the caseload per officer, having some balance so that the officers can actually function properly, I think is critical. And I think the third one is a recognition that the police department is not stagnant. We are a progressive police department, whether it's the body-worn camera pilot. I talked about the mental health that we are moving ahead with, the partnership, partnering with the Canadian Mental Health Association on having a civilian-only team, working with the City of Victoria, working with our health authorities on looking at alternatives to the current model of policing should give councils reassurance that the police department isn't just going down the same road, that we are progressive and making significant change to change the model of policing, but yet until there's other alternatives in place that are fully functioning that take our work away, you're left with a 911 call and your local police officer having to respond to it in the middle of the night. And that's just unfortunate, but that's the reality.
Thank you, Chief.
Councillor Rochford. I'd love to say you're the first person to yell at me today, but you weren't, so that's okay. I'm used to it. First, I'd just like to thank everyone for putting this forward and having these really difficult, respectful dialogue in this meeting. We talk about this stuff can't always be easy. So I do have a few questions. So you're asking for 3 new officers. Can you please tell me how that's going to affect Esquimalt? Are those officers being allocated strictly for Victoria, and what that would look like for us as a municipality?
Well, I'll start, and then Mr. Hercombe, you can just add if I miss anything. So the 3 officers are to fill current vacancies that we have. Those vacancies exist with our patrol division, which includes the Esquimalt division and the Victoria division. So they would serve both municipalities. It's a bit more complicated and complex to tell you where it is, but our goal is to increase the vacancies that we currently have with people off on occupational stress and physical injuries, is to fill some of those gaps with these officers. So they will be serving both communities.
Yeah, just to add to that, we have a number of positions that are new positions that have never been filled, and there are a number of positions that are vacant because we have to deal with other issues like WorkSafe, where we don't get 100% back, or we have accommodated officers and we have more accommodated officers than we have actual positions to put them in. So we have to vacate some other positions in the meantime. A lot of those positions are not dedicated municipal division positions. We do have some positions vacant in patrol, community services division, but there are others in such as court and professional standards, where we do have positions that we also need to fill, and those are positions that benefit both municipalities.
Okay, one other question. So I just see for your overtime budget lines for patrol and what that we're looking at, and I see the increased overtime in Victoria. However, the Esquimalt is down it seems a bit less. So when you come in, and this is all new to me, so please bear with me. When you're coming to us and asking for us to increase the budget from Esquimalt, we're paying for the overtime that's in Victoria, and what exactly does that entail?
So, for example, in patrol, we don't really differentiate where that overtime is generated. Quite often, we have officers that will be assigned to Esquimalt, but if those officers are not there, they'll be backfilled by officers from Victoria. That would show as overtime in Victoria, because we're backfilling those people going in there. So it's not something we could actually pull apart and differentiate.
Anything further?
Just in regards to downloading, kind of similar to Councillor Thompson's comments, in regards to specifically, because you are saying some of the concerns we're dealing with in Esquimalt is the mental health and addiction. In full disclosure, I've worked in the field for 16 years, so I appreciate the struggles that we're all dealing with in Greater Victoria. Have we gone to specifically the Minister of Mental Health and Addiction and said, this is an area we need financial help with to solve these problems, other than just the health authority, to be fair?
my understanding is that the Ministry of Mental Health and Addictions does not have a separate budget. That the budget that they use is from the Ministry of Health. That's my understanding. I have reached into previous ministers and I have not really had a lot of success. I've asked Mayor Helps to bridge the gap for me when she was mayor prior to October. But again, these are ongoing discussions I think that we need to continue to have with the Health Authority or the Minister of Mental Health and Addictions.
Councillor Cardona.
Thanks, and to the chair, and thank you very much for the presentation, which I thought was really illuminating. I want to pick up on some of the themes that were brought up earlier, including some of the questions and comments from Councillor Thompson. And I wanted to circle back around to the CSI. When I've taken a look, when I've done a deep dive on the Crime Severity Index, it's always a very shocking story to see that Victoria has this very high CSI. However, I do think that quite a lot is hidden in that single statistic, and when you actually disaggregate it, there's quite a lot of different subcategories, right? And if you look at violent crime, it's more or less flat. It goes up and down a little bit. It's down since the 1990s. What's gone way up is social disorder calls. And I think that's an indication that we've downloaded, in fact, homelessness, addictions, mental health, not only to our police services, but to bylaw, to fire department, and to parks, in fact. Our parks department deals with quite a lot. And so I just wanted to get a sense of what percentage of your time as a police department is spent dealing with these social disorder calls. I mean, we could look at the CSI as maybe a percentage. Maybe we can make some inferences about what that means in terms of time and resources. But help us get a better understanding of how much of your job is in fact dealing with unhoused people. People are having mental health crises. People are having addictions crises.
Well, first start off with the first part of your question, which is the Crime Severity Index. It looks at the severity and volume of crime. So when you're talking about social disorder or the police maintaining, minor offenses that may be occurring, they're not captured in the Crime Severity Index. It's the severity and the volume of crime. It's weighted, is how that's captured, and it's captured through StatsCan. So it's done in a universal way to provide a kind of level of consistency so that it can be used as a measure. I will tell you, it is one of many measures. If you go on to Open VicPD, you will notice that I showed you two of the metrics. I showed you caseload per officer and the Crime Severity Index. So I just wouldn't want to focus just on those two things. And those were just the two other metrics I picked for tonight. But I can tell you, statistics aside, the officers on the street can tell you what is going on our streets. And the level of violence that's there is second to none, more than any community. And again, the reason that is there is because we have a small municipal police department looking after the downtown core without the ability to have the Oak Bay Police Department, the Saanich Police Department, or the Central Saanich Police Department offset the Crime Severity Index. If you look at the greater central metropolitan area and you look at that, the Crime Severity Index comes way down, which shows you that if it was a regional approach to policing, we would be right amongst the average across this province and across the country. But what was your second question?
Giving us a sense of how much of your time and resources is spent dealing with homelessness, addictions, and mental health.
I don't want to put a percentage on it. You're putting me on the spot there, and I know that numbers matter. We just haven't done the calculation of it, but I can tell you that it is a drain on our resources. It's not just the camps or the 900 block of Pandora. Many of the supportive housing locations have a tremendous amount of violence, weapons, and there's a lot of criminality and victimization going there. And we know firsthand of the number of people that are extremely vulnerable and marginalized, how many of them are exploited on a daily basis. And so there's a commitment there from the Victoria Police Department that we are their voice, and it's important for us to keep them safe when they do report crime or when crime is brought to our attention.
Thanks very much for that. I really appreciate that. Let me put it this way. If we as governments, as jurisdictions, were to invest more, not just at municipal level, but also, let's say, the provincial level, if we were to invest more in social services so that there were fewer homeless people on the street, there are fewer people having mental health crises, there are fewer people dealing with addictions, would that mean, to your mind, that the VicPD would need fewer resources and therefore smaller budgetary lift?
Well, First off, I'd like to see that put in place. That's 32 years living in this city and being a police officer, I haven't seen it. And to be honest, I don't really see it on the horizon, and I'm an optimistic person. A lot of talk, not a lot of action, and not a lot of funding that is provided. And so, if we're talking about involuntary care, and we're talking about people with severe mental illness that nobody wants to talk about, and secure care, if we're talking about social reintegration, rehabilitation, recovery, now you've got my attention about what that may or may not look like. To add a few beds here and a few beds there is not really having a meaningful impact, but in an ideological world, yes. If the workload is taken away from the police in many of these areas, I'm not going to be asking for more officers. In fact, I'd welcome that. That's just not happening. But the other thing, Councillor Caradona, I think that's important to know, is that crime is increasing in other areas. Online crime. Most of us, usually kids age 12 and over, are leading a regular life and also an online digital life. And so now, we get into new complexities around crime and reporting crime. And so I think that it's important to know and recognize that as much as certain areas of crime may fall, which I hope they do, there's other areas where the police are going to be needed and are needed.
Thanks.
Councillor Boardman.
Thank you. I agree that having a highly functional police department is like having a good insurance policy. I agree with that statement. I just have a few questions. The percentage increase in the provisional budget is calculated based on the 2022 budget, but not actuals. So can you tell me when or if we'll have an opportunity to look at the 2022 actuals?
Yeah, we're working on year end right now, so probably, I'm going to say within the next 4 weeks, but Ms. Thompson can answer that one more accurately.
So through the chair, so yes, the Victoria Police Department's budget actually folds into the City of Victoria's budget, so the final numbers won't be out until after our audit, which is done in March, so we're talking about April. There will be preliminary numbers, but they won't be signed off until that time point.
Does VicPD generally balance their budget year over year?
I'll start and Steve can chime in. So yeah, so what the framework agreement actually outlines the way that any surplus or deficit is allocated. So it net zero in the end because any remaining funding gets allocated to several different reserves.
So is there usually remaining funding or is there usually a deficit?
Usually remaining funding.
Okay. Okay, thanks. Second question. I see that there in section F, that's the for the inspector of Esquimalt. So that tells me what sort of the Esquimalt hub, I suppose, the budget for them. But the officers for Esquimalt are accounted for in the general patrol section. So is there a section, or has there ever been, or will there ever be one that'll say what the total cost of the policing for Esquimalt is, including the inspector division and the patrol?
No, there hasn't, and unless we have a better way of pulling data on individual files, it's not likely. I mean, we don't. I'll give you an example. For example, when in investigative work on a file from beginning to end, we don't capture all of the costs of that. So what you see under the Inspector of Esquimalt Division is really just the units that fall under the inspector. It does not represent the cost of providing policing in Esquimalt, and we don't break those costs out. That would be very time consuming to do.
Sure, I guess it'd be easy to cost out the 21 officers, but then there's all the other supports that require that.
Yeah, and those are really, when you talk about the dedicated municipal divisions, you're talking to people at the division and their frontline response there. You're not talking about the investigative and all the other things that come with it.
Okay, thanks. And then one last question, if I may. With respect to the new officers, so they're meant to offset the off-duty officers, so I understand that. But my assumption is that you already have funding for those police officers that are off, that are being paid via some other mechanism. And what happens when they come back? So we're asking for permanent funding for 3 officers. So are these gonna be supernumerary officers, or can you just give us a bit more detail about that, please?
Sure. So there are a number of reasons why an officer may be unavailable for full duty. WorkSafe is one of those. We have a significant number on WorkSafe. We don't get 100% of those costs back through WorkSafe. It ends up being slightly more than half. So we can't replace everybody that's off on WorkSafe. So that leaves us short of funds to fill all of those positions. We also have a number of officers that are required to be accommodated, and we don't always have enough positions that are fully funded in the org chart positions for those people. They're still actively working, they're still contributing. However, in order to keep them working, we have to leave other positions open, as in we can't do them. So over the years, we've had to actually collapse the crime reduction unit. We had to pull back the school resource officers, just what we're aware of. In this restructuring, we are unable to fully staff the Beat and Bite section. So there are a number of places where we don't have enough people to fill those seats right now for those reasons. We don't have full funding for all of the people on WorkSafe, and we have a number of people who are working. They just can't fulfill all of the functions that we would like to fulfill.
Sure, I understand that. Ultimately though,
I just wanted to just add to the second part of your question. I see where your logic is going, right? If, when the officers are healthy and they come back, well, we're asking for a lift, and I think that's a good question to ask. Here's what we have found in the last number of years. Since there was presumptive legislation put in place by WorkSafe, that if an officer was off on an occupational stress injury, it was presumed that it was from on-duty exposure. We have seen the trend to a number that we know, we're not seeing more officers come back. I will tell you that almost for every 2 officers that are coming on, there's 2 that are going off. And we've kind of hit that point. The first year or 2, we were wondering, going, okay, well, this is a year 1, year 2, and it's a blip, and then afterwards it'll kind of level out. And now we've seen over a number of years what the trend line is. And I mean, I hope I'm incorrect, but the numbers and the trend just doesn't indicate that the officers are going to be back to what we are going to be able to absorb. And by the way, we have so many retirements that happen every year, every January, that if that was to happen, we would be able to make that adjustment if we saw a trend in a positive fashion where more officers were coming back than we anticipated.
thank you.
So I have 3 more speakers on the list, and we have 10 minutes left in the scheduled time. So if you can be succinct from both sides, and remember to hang on to your questions for your council meetings as well. So I have Councillor Coleman, Dell, and then Councillor Kim and Councillor Loudon.
Thank you. 4 questions, so I'll try and be succinct. Body-worn camera pilot. You have 150,000 down here. How many officers is that a pilot project for? Because the follow-up question is, what's the rollout to the full assembly of VicPD?
Actually, that significant amount of those costs for that pilot is actually for freedom of information disclosure. Because for the pilot project itself, the body-worn cameras surprisingly are actually not the largest expense. It's the software and it's the disclosure and FOI that come with it. So the purpose of that project is not to roll it out to a large amount, it's to roll it out to specific sections to test it so that we can come back with a proposal on whether it's viable and how much it would actually cost to roll out a full program.
Thank you. But how many officers would you be rolling it out with?
Yeah, I don't have the exact number.
That's fine. Thank you. Second question, and it depends on how you look at the issue. Clearly, there's a difference around the table. I looked at the 260,000 for psychological supports, and when you still have 242 sworn officers with 20% off, I think at the moment, somewhere around there. That works out to $90 per month per officer. I looked at it and thought, too low. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a start, it's an investment. I mean, as the chief alluded to, like our work safe time loss is significant compared to where we were a few years ago. It's equivalent to losing a dozen officers or more at any point in time. So the more we can invest in that.
Thank you. I'll make this the last question. There is one way of looking at policing and asking the question about if you brought down the severity of crime index, could we stabilize the budget or could we reduce the budget? That's, remember the 9th principle of Helium Principles of Policing. The objective or the principle, the evidence of good policing is the lack of crime, not the police response to it. That then I think becomes a bridge to do the proactive policing. Would you like to comment on that around things like restorative justice, school policing, the Indigenous engagement strategy? Because I think that's the way to answer that question.
Yeah, to Mayor Desjardins, I'll keep my comments succinct for the time. I would say that, as I said in my earlier remarks, community policing is an important part and an important model of police engaging with community and all communities. And our communities, not just our Indigenous and racialized communities, but all communities are wanting to see police in a leadership role, working with them. I think it's important and it leads to healthy communities. Thank you.
Councillor Dale.
I'd just like to ask quickly about regional policing. I mean, I think there's a lot of agreement that regional policing is needed. I think we seem to be waiting around for someone else to do it. No one's really advocating for it. No one's talking about it enough. And I don't know if that should be my responsibility. So I'd like to ask you on regional policing, are you talking to other chiefs about it? Are you advocating for it with council, with the province? And if not, whose role do you think that is to start pushing for that? Is that something that is our Victoria role, considering we are taking the brunt of the regionalization? Or do you think that is something that we should be waiting around for MLAs to do?
So I have brought it up with my chiefs, and as soon as I start talking about it, they walk away. They don't want anything to do with it. And so, is it your job, Councillor Dell, to talk about that? I think it's probably everyone's job, regardless of what level of government that you're in. I think it's an important step. If you looked at the recommendations coming on the Special Committee on Reforming the Police Act, it talked about there is actually not only just a regional kind of amalgamated solution, but also perhaps a provincial police force for the province of BC. So these discussions, at the end of the day, are the responsibility of the provincial government. They're the ones who would have to make the change, or at least initiate the change and show leadership. But in the meantime, I think it's everyone's responsibility to advocate for what a safe Victoria looks like, because I don't know many people who just live in their municipality and don't cross borders into other municipalities. I think public safety should be a regional approach.
One more quick question. When you came on November 22nd, we looked at the data, which is an incredible amount of data, but also to me looks like the most expensive data set, I'm sure locally. And I just know it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of work and a lot of money, and I think you said you're doing that to kind of please us and see where things are going. And I can't help but thinking with this 9% request and our property tax, it's maybe not the best use of resources is this data collection. Where can we have that conversation?
I'm going to let Deputy Watson answer this one.
Yeah, sorry, Councillor Dell, I'm not entirely sure I'm totally clear on your question, but having good quality data and being able to make these recommendations and decisions on policing is super important, as too is an assessment of the costs and challenges associated with collecting that data. So, being really clear on what it is that we want to know, and then trying to introduce something that allows us to do that is really the big question. And then having the resources to actually then analyze it and chop it up and then be able to report out on it, particularly in context, is really important.
I have Councillor Kim next.
Thank you. Thank you. There was mention of the need for better proactive and community policing. And Chief Manick, you said that a good investment pays off in dividends. And this budget to me still strikes me as quite reactive, especially given the observation about the minimal amount of funding going into psychological services, for example. So I guess my question is, at what point will budget increase truly satisfy the need for proactive and community policing to then meet that threshold to start decreasing budget increases over the coming years?
Yeah, I see the budget a bit differently than you do. I think that it's a work in progress. It really depends on, your police department is doing a lot of heavy lifting for many other regional partners. That's the reality. And I think it's important to acknowledge that this is the reality that we live in. I wish there was less downloading. I wish we were in a position where we came in with a lower number. And again, this budget is supported by the police board. They're asking all these hard questions that you're asking us to talk about. But I think that until there's additional supports and resources that are added, there needs to, governments at all levels need to make investment in many, many areas that currently are invested. And I think once we do that, we can then have a discussion of what the police department's role is in community. But as it stands today, our call volume and the requests for our services keep going up, despite all of the narrative that's out there that we don't want police engaged in certain areas. So I would like to see that enhanced and then have a further discussion when that is actually a reality.
Thank you. And I do want to say I appreciate you answering these difficult questions and trying to convince us when we hold the purse strings. My last question is, given that there is actually remaining funding year over year, it seems, and given that proposed budgets tend to actually go on the higher side rather than the conservative to make sure that there is room for unexpected expenditures, what's an actual conservative estimate of a proposed budget then compared to what we've seen today?
I'll let the controller kind of comment on it. I'll give it a start to say that the budget process is quite complex, and there's a high level of accountability from the police board and the finance committee, and this is the budget that's required to maintain adequate and effective policing. Mr. Hercombe, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, no, just that, in years where we've had surpluses, it's typically because we have positions that we haven't had to fill. In the last few years, we did have a significant number of retirements, so it's taken us actually a long time to get back to a healthy position, and our surpluses have been diminishing accordingly if we've actually been staffing up those positions. So, in some respects, having that surplus was not a good thing. Financially it was, but from an operational point of view, it was not a good thing. And we have actually just starting to get back to a good place in terms of being able to resource our front line. And when you talk about the resources going back into proactive policing, a lot of those resources had to be pulled back from some proactive policing in order to make sure that we had the resources to meet those calls for service. And I'd say this is probably like we're at the first time in a few years where we're actually finally at a good place on patrol, where we can actually resource that adequately, and we need to start focusing now towards resourcing those other proactive areas.
Councillor Lund.
Everyone,
My question is pretty simple. There's one interim shelter, like temporary shelter, that's not exactly the same as the shelter hotels, and that's the shipping container project at 940 Caledonia. Can you tell me the number of police calls that have been made to 940 Caledonia?
Yeah, Councillor Loudon, I don't have those numbers in front of me, but you're correct that what was called the Tiny Homes project right by Royal Athletic Park there has been successful. It's run by an extremely competent service provider. There are a lot of rules and regulations and a screening and assessment process as to who was able to reside in that location. So I think that that speaks to some of the success. The fact that there's good leadership, good staff, they're on the same page, and the clientele and the residents of that location are not high needs, and there's not significant criminality within there with the oversight that they've been able to provide. It's certainly been much, much less on the police's attention than some of the other supportive housing locations.
I'm going to look once more around just to make sure I've got everyone. On behalf of the police board, I want to say thank you. Your questions have been very probing, very good, very respectful. And of course, this is step one, and you will have further discussions at your tables. But I think it's been a valuable conversation to have councils come together with the board so that we can all hear each other and what our thoughts are. So I want to thank you all for tonight and safe travels home. I'm going to turn it over to Mayor Alto. All right. And so we are done. Thank you very much, and thanks for the presentation, staff.